resolve deadly conflicts around the world. We are delighted that you have joined us today for this online discussion about Nigeria's elections, and more specifically about the promise that this election holds and its potential pitfalls. I'd like to introduce you to Murithi Mutiga, our Africa Program Director, and Nnamdi Obasi, our Senior Advisor for Nigeria. Just to tell you a little bit about the format of today's discussion, we will first have a moderated discussions with our two panelists, and then we will open the floor for the Q&A session. If you would like to submit a question, please use the chat or the Q&A box, stating your name and your affiliation. And I would also like to remind everyone that this call will be recorded and live streamed on Crisis Group's YouTube channel. So first, we'd like to go to Murithi. Murithi, can you tell us why this election matters?
Yeah, thanks, Pauline, and thanks everyone for joining. I'll try to be very brief because I'm sure most people are very anxious to listen to Nnamdi, our expert on Nigeria, long-time observer of the situation there. Well, why does this election matter? Nigeria matters. And, Nigeria almost matters because it's Nigeria, There are very few countries on the continent that can match its political, diplomatic, economic heft. And even psychologically, it's one of the countries that's most watched on the continent. And so trends there matter. They matter not just for the continent, but also for West Africa, where it is by far the most important player. I think just to look at this election in terms of what we'll be watching from outside Nigeria, I'm sure Nnamdi will be covering the context internally. But there are a couple of things, just to open with the positives. I think the fact that elections have become routinized in Nigeria is important. I think the fact that it's not just that elections are taking place regularly, but that it's a reasonably and predictable election. I think that's really important, especially in a context where we see a bit of a recession in democratic norms in West Africa. I think it's really to Nigeria's credit that we are only a couple of hours away from voting, but we don't really know who's going to win. So it's going to be a meaningful election, hopefully. I think while, of course, a lot of the coverage is focused on the candidates, and I'm sure, listeners are very eager to know what the stakes are, but to a certain degree, from the electoral institutional perspective, I think it's positive that you have an electoral commission that seems to command reasonable degrees of respect, that is really seeming to try its best to inject technology to improve the transparency of the vote and to make sure that the voting actually matters. I think that's broadly positive. I think the final element is the fact that during the course of registration, we saw very high levels of youth enthusiasm. This came on the back, of course, of the NSAS protest that we witnessed a couple of years ago. While the youth may not overall be the determinants in this picture, because they make up the bulk of the new voters, but the fact that they are keen to vote, the fact that they registered in very high numbers, I think that's something that counts to the credit of the process. But then on the flip side, and now turning to the negatives, which are not insubstantial, and I'm sure we'll be discussing in quite some detail later, just the whole organizational apparatus and the environment in which the vote is taking place, and particularly what can only be described as a fiasco with this change and the redesign of the currency, and the dangers that might then end up suppressing the vote in a context where already enthusiasm seemed very high. I think that's disappointing. Let's hope that one way or the other, it doesn't end up having a very negative impact, and it will be something to watch. Another facet that is not really, people will have different views about it, but Nigeria has been an exemplar on the continent in terms of power rotation and power sharing. I think the fraying of some of those norms, especially in terms of both geographic, religious rotation of power, I think what that might mean for long run acceptance of the legitimacy of leadership is something to watch. And finally, just the whole security environment, quite concerning for reasons that some of the viewers and listeners will know. We just had news over the last 24 hours of the Senate candidate in Enugu East being killed. It's worrying that you have many parts of the country experiencing considerable insecurity. And what that says about Nigeria's trajectory, considering again how important Nigeria is something for us to consider. So absolutely a really important election, and one which people will watch very keenly outside Nigeria.
Well, thank you, Murithi. I'd like to go to Nnamdi now. Nnamdi, you have followed many Nigerians in many elections in Nigeria. We've seen 6 elections since Nigeria transited from military to civilian rule in 1999. And what makes this election stand out for you? Why is it different from the past?
Thank you very much, Pauline, and thanks everyone. It's a very different kind of election. It's significantly different in at least 6 or 7 ways. For one, it's being held with the largest number of registered voters, the largest population of registered voters. The last election, we had 84 million people on the voters register, but now we have 93 million people, almost 10 million more. And this is a huge number. I mean, if you think of it, the number of voters for all the other 14 West African countries combined is not up to this number. This number is larger than the electorates of the other 14 countries. So it's a huge challenge, and that's something different from the past. Secondly, as Murithi mentioned earlier on, we're having a much greater participation of young people in the election. Basically arising from 3 factors. One, the NSAS protest, which gave the young people a sense of their ability, of their power to, push for change. Secondly, the very desperate situation in the country economically, security-wise, and so on. And people are really yearning for a change in the quality of governance. And then, of course, thirdly, the entry into the race of Peter Obi, the Labour Party presidential candidate, who, for some of the young people, seem to embody their vision for the country. So he's really electrified the grounds, and we're having a lot more young people engaging in the process now. The third thing is that we're having, for the first time, a strong 3-way, contest, unlike in the past where we used to have just the 2 parties, PDP and APC, and then all the other ones at the fringes. This is the first time that we're having 3 strong parties, and even a 4th, one, maybe not as strong as the other 3, but still substantial. So it's a much more unpredictable race, than we ever had in the past. And that is also, in addition to that, is the fact that for the first time in 20 years, President Buhari is not on the ballot. And so there's a scramble for his support, the large number of supports that he used to have, solidly. Then 4 candidates are struggling now to see, what they can get out of that. So it adds to the unpredictability. Then, of course, for the first time, Electoral Commission is using more advanced technologies for the conduct of the elections, both in terms of voter accreditation and for the transmission of results live. The sense is that this would be perhaps a cleaner election, more transparent election, than in the past. But then on the other side is we are also holding this election in an atmosphere of insecurity that is more widespread and more generalized than the past. We've had elections in the past in which we had Boko Haram in the northeast, but now we're dealing with some degree of Boko Haram in the northeast, bandits in the northwest, heather farmer tensions, still in the middle belt, and a terribly deteriorated situation in the southeast. As Murithi mentioned, the Senate candidate of the Labour Party was shot dead yesterday and his car burnt. And members of APC, the ruling party APC and PDP as well were attacked by gunmen. So it's very difficult to see how elections would run smoothly in those areas and what the turnout would be. And then finally is the fact that this is the first election on which, just the month before, a couple of months before, the government introduced, a new currency, redesigned the currency. Now, the redesigned currency was supposed to have been swapped, fully by now, but we still are in a very, very difficult situation. It's not just available. A lot of people don't have, even money to buy things along the road. People can't travel to their polling areas, to go and vote because they don't have the money to travel with. This is something unique to this election, and we don't know how it will affect the Electoral Commission's logistics, voter turnout, And of course, it's already added to the tensions in the country. So it might actually, bleed into post-election tensions, and that's something to watch.
Thanks, Nnamdi. So I'm based in South Africa, and I'm actually here getting the question if Peter Obi can actually win. But this is a question we might want to address much later. Let's first go into a few details of what you've just described. Another question I would have for you is, you said that a lot of youth have registered, and this is unique for this election, but still voter turnout in the actual elections when they were being held on voting day has been falling over the years. And do you think that's a sign that fewer Nigerians care about democracy, or have they lost faith in their leaders? What are there concerns about the health of Nigerian democracy?
Yes, you're quite correct. The voter numbers have been falling over the years. I mean, in the 1999 election, I think about 50% of registered voters actually voted. In 2003, about 66% or something like that actually voted. But then from that point, the numbers started to dwindle. The percentages started to dwindle. So by the last election in 2019, we only got a 34% turnout. That is also consistent with the polls that have been conducted, asking people how they felt about the state of Nigeria's democracy. There was a poll, very, very credible last year, in which 70% of people said they were disappointed, with the quality of democracy and the failure to deliver results and so on and so forth. But we're hopeful that, with the more greater enthusiasm that the young people are showing, and with the greater interest in the electoral process by lots and lots of people, we're hoping that the turnout this time would be on the aggregate, on the national aggregate, that the turnout would be higher, even though in some areas that have serious security challenges, we're also afraid that the voter turnout may even be worse, maybe depressed, worse than the last election.
So you mentioned security issues now, and of course the security agencies in Nigeria are very key to how this election will be run and the success of the election, so we could say that, and also the performance of the Electoral Commission. Are these institutions ready for the elections? What's your assessment?
Well, the security agencies, given repeated assurances, the Chief of Defense Staff, the Chief of Army Staff, the Inspector General of Police, and others, have given assurances, they are prepared, they are on top of the situation, and so on and so forth. But we are still very concerned about what is really the reality on the ground. As we mentioned, earlier on, we still had yesterday a candidate for the election being shot dead and others being attacked. And just 2 weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago, the convoy, the entourage of the vice presidential candidate of the People's Democratic Party was attacked and 3 policemen killed. Police stations have been attacked continuously in the southeast. Last week, a training center where INEC, the Electoral Commission, was training ad hoc staff, was attacked, and then they had to disrupt the training and flee, and so on and so forth. So it's still to be seen how well the security will be managed. As we say, security services, for all the good intentions, have capacity deficits, they have manpower deficits and so on. It's difficult to see how they would be able to deploy comprehensively across the country. Of course, they're also doing their own marketing. Highest. And the Electoral Commission, again, going ahead with the election, that it's moved sensitive materials to the states and so on and so forth. But then we've had a situation with the well, they are able to run parts of the country, and through the goodwill is concerned. I mean, the INEC has a lot of goodwill. The organization is seen as impartial, and the chairman has a lot of integrity. So in terms of integrity and impartiality, we have no problem at all about that. And the government, so President Buhari's government, has not at any time tampered with the conduct of the Electoral Commission. It provides all the resources that needs to be done, doesn't try to bend the rules and so on and so forth. So to that extent, we are hopeful that we'll be able to pull through.
There was a little breakup in the transmission there, Nnamdi. I think you're speaking to us from Abuja, and maybe the electricity is not always reliable. Sorry about that. Well, I heard most of what you said. Just on the attacks that you mentioned, I was wondering, can you briefly explain what's behind those kind of attacks that you just described? Is it political? Is it political rivalry? Is it militancy? Nigeria is a very big country, and of course, lots of attacks have happened in recent weeks. But those specific attacks you described, what's behind that?
Well, it's a product of several factors. In some areas, like the Northeast and the Northwest, where you have organized armed groups, communities, are attacked by these groups. And but in the Southeast, it's a very different situation. The agitation for a separate Biafran Republic has grown increasingly radical. And then there's a mixture of factions of the agitators who are hardliners, who have sworn that they would not allow elections to hold. But then there are also criminal organizations, operating in that environment that are using the Biafra agitation, as a cover-up for purely criminal activities. So, there could point to several factors contributing to the violence. Of course, to some degree, rivalry between parties and candidates in a very acrimonious environment. So you can't rule out the fact that we've had incidents in which it was one party against another, or agents of one party or one candidate, attacking others. So it's a mixture of several factors.
And if we look specifically at the Northeast, I think, as you said before, it has been always very difficult to get people to polling stations there because of security reasons. How do you assess the situation in the Northeast now? Because there's a lot of displaced people. People have had to flee their homes, lost all their things. Would they even care about voting on this day? Is that a priority for them?
Well, actually, the situation in the Northeast is considerably better now than it was in 2015, and still an improvement on 2019. The insurgent groups, the terrorist groups, Boko Haram, ISWAP, have been mainly pushed out to the fringes of Lake Chad and in parts of the northeast of Borno State and so on and so forth. So in some parts of the state, actually, displaced persons have been taken back to their ancestral homes and resettled, even though there's still concern about the risk, in those places. The state capital, the Borno state capital, Maiduguri, is more relaxed now than it used to be. I was quite frequent there 2013, 2014, and it used to be a lot of unease and uncertainty. It's a very volatile environment. So to that extent, I think there's a better control a better hold of things, in the Northeast.
Mm-hmm. So we have the security situations you described. It's good to hear that things are improving in the Northeast. But now the new problem, in fact, that you have touched upon is the reports about fuel and cash scarcities. How are you experiencing that yourself? And what's the situation now? Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because I heard it's gone really to the top of Nigeria's leadership, and there's lots of not only acrimony, but disputes about how this is being handled. Can you describe a little bit of what's going on?
Well, it's, as I said earlier on, a very dire situation at the moment. People can't get the new currency. The president made a broadcast on Thursday last week and said the three denominations of the currency, the 200 naira, the 500 and the 1,000, that the 500 and the 1,000 will cease to be legal tender, but that the 200, can still be used until the 10th of April. But the reality at the moment is that banks, are overwhelmed completely by people who are desperate to get some money just to eat, just to buy things along the road, just to a few things. I have run on less than $100, less than a $10 equivalent, in naira in terms of the card that I have in hand. We have to do a lot of card payments through bank cards, or transfers from one account to the other. You get into a cab and you negotiate with the driver, and then you transfer money to his account. And in some cases, the drivers are just not ready to accept that, or they add a premium, to the fare. And for some people, it's extremely, extremely difficult. So that's adding a lot of tension in some of the states. I mean, in several states, at least 8 or 9 or 10 states, banks have actually been attacked by angry mobs and burnt down, completely. So we are also very concerned about how this, fits into existing election tensions.
I would imagine that this is feeding some conspiracy theories that this was a deliberate attempt to sabotage the elections. Is that the case?
Yes, I mean, there are all kinds of theories on ground, but the president insists that, and the governor of the central bank insists that, this was done first in the interest of the economy, to improve security and reduce kidnapping and so on, but also to mop up, huge amounts of money that politicians were holding. The president himself said pointedly he wouldn't sit down and watch people with huge amounts of money, buying thugs and buying votes, during the election. So this was partly, as he said, with a good intention to achieve a better election, a cleaner election. But then we're also concerned that this could backfire because people are really very desperate and they would accept, very little amounts of money now to sell their votes and just go and eat and go home. So it's something to watch very seriously.
So the strategy is actually to reduce vote buying, could actually spur vote buying.
Right. Yeah. That's a fear now.
Yeah, that is a fear. Have you seen any signs of that, or is that way too early? Incidents of vote buying, or have there been reports of vote buying really, or is that not the case?
Well, first of all, our experience is that, over the years, the political process, the electoral process has been progressively monetized. The primaries of the parties, the major parties in May last year, there were numerous credible reports of huge amounts of money that were paid to the delegates in order to secure their support. So, right from that level, we knew that vote buying was likely to increase. But the fact also that INEC, the Electoral Commission, by its improvement of election technology, has made it more difficult for politicians and parties and candidates to alter figures, from polling booths to local government collation centers, to the state collation center, to the INEC headquarters in Abuja and so on. So in a situation where they can't, rig the election through the old methods, there's a concern that they may be more determined, to explore new devices in order to corrupt the vote. So there's a real concern about vote buying, especially in an environment in which people are just cashless and desperate.
Maybe, Pauline, if I could just jump in quickly. I think, participants may want to look up our Hold Your Fire podcast that discussed Nigeria very recently with Nnamdi and Ayobe, one of the crisis group trustees. And she had a memorable phrase for putting it that, it's a bit like burning your house to chase out a rat. So, I mean, it seems a very excessive approach to dealing with what seems a genuine problem. But I think one point Nnamdi made on the podcast, which is a bit worrying, is the way in which, if this is perceived in a conspiratorial fashion, is the way in which, if the outcome doesn't favor one or the other of the candidates that feels that this was targeted at them, then how might they respond? And I think that's really worrying. I think it's really essential to try and manage that. And I'm sure we'll be coming to that in terms of the post-election environment.
Yeah, just to follow up on that right away, the candidate of the ruling party, the APC, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, has said publicly that this was targeted. He was the target of this action, and his position has been echoed by the governors of Kaduna and Kano states. So there's a strong feeling already that the odds are being piled up against him. And in the event that the party loses the election, they could look back and say, well, we already were undermined and sabotaged by the action of the government in the currency policy that went bad. On the other hand, I'm also hearing that some of the Obi, the Labour Party people, I mean, lots of them, as I said earlier, are students in schools. The federal government has shut down universities yesterday and asked all students to go home so that they can vote. But at the moment, lots of students are stranded in their schools because they don't have the cash, to travel home. So conceivably, think that after the election, if that party loses, then it says, a lot of our supporters were disenfranchised as a result of, this cash policy. So it could have, implications for the acceptability of results at the end of the elections.
But then the candidates that you're talking of, and also of the other political parties that are participating, 18 in total, they've signed 2 peace accords. If I remember this correctly, the second was just yesterday, committing to peaceful campaigns to respect the outcome of the elections. Is this, it's very good to have these peace accords, but is there still a risk of violence during and after the polls?
Oh, yes, I mean, there is. First of all, the compliance with the peace accord, I mean, whatever may be said about, the merits of the peace accord, compliance is voluntary. It's not, the National Peace Committee can't enforce, the signatories to comply with the provisions of the accord. And then the sense also is the parties are saying, we will respect the results if we are convinced that the elections are free and fair. So there's a big if there. And, if at the end of it, the elections, for some reason or the other, failure flaws in electoral administration, security issues, and so on, and then the cash issue that we just talked about, all this can create grounds for parties to reject the outcome of the results. And then the second thing is that sometimes the parties and the candidates are not really are not in control of their supporters. I mean, even if the candidates and the parties sign a peace accord, the young men on the streets, the vast number of supporters of each of these parties may not feel, bound by that agreement, and therefore, if they lose at the end of the day, they might still, march to the streets, and protests can always turn, to something else. So there's still a real risk of violence during and after the elections, regardless of the peace accord and its merits.
And just briefly, Pauline, sorry, just to say that I think this is a structural issue we see with presidential contests across the continent. It's very much viewed as a winner-take-all affair. And therefore, defeat is very, very difficult to stomach, not just for the candidates, but also for constituents that feel that they might benefit from patronage politics. So I think, especially in a context where you don't really have power-sharing arrangements, where, again, as I mentioned, the rotation of power is fraying, I think there will be that temptation to view the election in maximalist terms. And I think one of the worrying aspects in this election is that the confidence all the major candidates are projecting and basically assuring their constituents that there's no way they could lose. I think that's a degree, an element that we should watch with a degree of caution.
And so because we're speaking about the candidates, I think a lot of people who are listening to this event might are wondering if the third big candidate, Peter Obi, really has a chance of winning. And it seems so unusual that he's garnered so much support, at least what we can see online, that he's garnered online support, which doesn't necessarily mean that people who like him will actually go and vote for him. But he could maybe serve as a kingmaker. How do you see his role in this election, Nnamdi? And very basic question, and I know you don't hold a crystal ball, but what are his actual chances of winning?
I think the first is everybody acknowledges that he's been run a phenomenal campaign. Initially, nobody gave him a chance. And he's running on the platform of a party that is almost, previously almost insignificant. I mean, in the 2019 election, the presidential candidate of the party won only 5,074 votes out of about 28 million votes cast. That was something like 0.002%, of the votes, completely negligible. And then, now we are seeing a Labour Party presidential candidate that everybody accepts that he is a strong contender, for the office. So to that extent, we concede that, he's been a phenomenon. Everybody agrees to that. But, he also faces very serious hurdles, and it's difficult to say now, who is going to win and who is not winning. There've been opinion polls, on all sides, claiming that, one party would win by a landslide, or the other. But as we always say, these polls need to be taken with a great deal of caution, also because of the small size of the samples and the sometimes questionable methodology by which they are conducted. Thirdly, is the fact that for all his popularity and his ability to galvanize voters and so on and so forth, the party still is in a very weak position as far as the other offices are concerned. In many states, they don't even have candidates for governor or for the House of Representatives or for the Senate and so on and so forth. And even where they have, I hear people saying, well, on the national level, we will vote for Obi as president, but at the state level, we will vote for the PDP or the APC because these are where they have more influential politicians who have deeper pockets and have more connections with various groups on ground and so on. So he also still had a lot of challenge in spite of the phenomenal success, if you like, of his campaign.
Do you think that this party has sort of been able to step up and support him in his campaign, or is the campaign or his popularity right now among young voters, is that really based on his charisma or his track record? How do you see his rise to prominence?
Well, the first thing is that he was a former governor of Anambra State in the southeast. And even his worst opponents agree that he ran a very clean government. There is no evidence, there's never been any evidence of,
we seem to have lost Nnamdi there. Let's see, we have some connection issues today. I'm not sure how quickly we can get Nnamdi back. Murithi, would you like to comment?
Yeah, so just to say, Pauline, I also lost my power and then it came back on for a second. Sorry about that. And it's a bit of an irony because Kenyans have been, parading themselves as having much more reliable power than you in South Africa or in Nigeria. But let's hope we'll get Nnamdi back soon. Just, I think the phenomenon that we've seen with Peter Obi is really interesting. I think it signals, just on the broad level, a challenge to the very identitarian politics that we've seen in Nigeria for a long time, and which has been very, very focused, on who you are, what religion you are, what region you're from. So it's a real breath of fresh air, and it's not just something we see in Nigeria. It's something we see in political contests across the continent. I'm sure you'll have followed some of the Kenyan election, where social and economic rights have become much more important, especially to young voters, than to whether you stood up to the military powers in the past, or whether you are a pro-democracy campaigner in the 90s, which is something very laudable and which is something some of the candidates can mention. And so somebody coming in and saying, I'll be able to offer effective governance, I'll be able to run a clean government, and basically gaining traction, even if, of course, the polls might be overstating his support, even if, as we know, that, in the north, where he doesn't seem to enjoy a lot of support, many people won't be taking part in the surveys, which are done sometimes electronically. And, so the polls might be, of course, we must take them with a bit of a pinch of salt. But I think the psychological effect of his candidacy and the importance of that, I think cannot be understated, whether he wins or loses. I think another interesting facet, and sorry if I'm anticipating some of your later questions, but I think the question that I find really fascinating is what happens if he wins or if he loses. I think for Obi, in a context where politics is so heavily patronage-based, and where, there's an informal arrangement about how to share the cake, especially, unfortunately, among the elite. If he were to win, I think he would face a very steep challenge in terms of winning over the people that have come to expect basically to get a share of the pie in terms of patronage politics. So I think if he wins, he would face a steep challenge to gain acceptance and legitimacy from the elite. But if he loses, there will be crushing disappointment among many young Nigerians, as Nnamdi described, who saw him as this hopeful figure, as somebody that's relatively clean and somebody that can potentially steer the country, which again, as we know, and I hate to quote cliches, but it's a really important country, expected to be the third most populous in the world by 2050. And so, you know, a lot of people have projected their hope on him, and if he loses, there'll be great disappointment. I think the other element is that if the other candidates win, and you know, in this case, Atiku Abubakar or Tinubu, I think the challenge for them is how to manage the disappointment among people, especially the young, that will be bitterly disappointed at their victory, and that will perceive that you know, it's just a continuation of the same old, same old. So I think win or lose, it's important, but the way that you know, his victory or defeat will be handled post-election will be really fascinating.
And before I ask you the next question, and while we wait for Nnamdi to come back in, I would like to remind everybody, or I would like to gently ask everybody who is listening to this, if they have any questions, please submit them in the chat box, and we will run them by Nnamdi and Murithi. In the Q&A box, sorry. Yes, the Q&A box is under the screen, so please feel free to submit your questions with your name and affiliation, please. So Murithi, is this election being watched in East Africa, where you are?
Nigerian elections are always keenly watched, certainly well beyond Nigeria, as I mentioned. I think the thing about elections in Nigeria, of course, just beyond their importance to Nigeria and to the region, is just that whoever ends up leading Nigeria will have a very decisive effect in terms of the cohesiveness, the effectiveness of the regional bloc in ECOWAS. And the way that Nigerian elections tend to be viewed is, what does that mean for the totems of the various regions? You know, South Africa is obviously the main actor in the south, Nigeria in the west, there's almost an Algeria-Egypt tandem in the north. So they definitely are watched keenly. There is a perception that Nigeria has been a bit absent on the continental scene. So it will be curious to see whether, you know, whoever wins augurs a bit of a return to more assertive presence of Nigeria in terms of the continental diplomacy.
We have Nnamdi back. I see Nnamdi, can you hear us? Nnamdi? No. There really seems to be a problem in Abuja right now. Normally we have a fairly good connection with Nnamdi, but I guess not today, which is quite unfortunate. So Murithi, you've recently written about, helped co-write a report on the African Union. Again, it touches a bit on what you said before. Is Nigeria debate, or not a debate, but how influential is it in the African Union?
Yes, so yes, we recently published a report about you know, what to expect and what the priorities are for the African Union in the coming year. Incidentally, we left the Nigerian election out, apart from a mention that there will be important elections, not just in Nigeria, but in Zimbabwe, in the DRC, and a few others. But in essence, it used to be that Nigeria was one of the giants on the continental scene that would shape a lot of debate and would help the continent project its position externally. And for example, in the Obasanjo years, he alongside the likes of Thabo Mbeki and Meles Zenawi were the most prominent voices projecting viewpoints from the continent. I think that's been missing over the last couple of years for a variety of reasons, including the fact that Nigeria has been so domestically preoccupied on the security and also on the economic front. So we don't really know what to expect about what comes next in Nigeria and what to expect from the leadership, particularly because this is a moment when, of course, with the war in Ukraine, with a lot of debate about how to respond with potentially an opening, although maybe that's being over-optimistic, for multilateral, the reform of major multilateral institutions, and especially the UN, even if it doesn't end up being actual change in the UN Security Council, you'd expect that Nigeria and South Africa will be the voices that are most prominent. So this will be an important election from that standpoint, whether Nigeria will in fact try and inch back into a position of greater and more assertive leadership. But just to say, in West Africa, this is particularly important. As you know, in the past, Nigeria was one of the few countries on the continent that was willing to intervene in the affairs, especially of its smaller neighbors. And we saw that particularly with the civil war in Sierra Leone and also in Liberia. That absence of leadership matters in a context, as I said, of democratic recession, but also very acute security and political challenges in West Africa and the Sahel more broadly.
We have an interesting question we have from Eva Oude Elfrink, which is both for Nnamdi and for you, but because we still don't have Nnamdi back, maybe you can have a stab at it, Murithi. The question is how would you explain the low participation of women candidates in this election? And maybe that your answer could also translate a little bit to what you've seen in the Kenyan elections recently, but I'll leave it up to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's a shame that we don't have Nnamdi here because, of course, he'll know the domestic context much better. But it's been really striking, and it's an element I've had discussed about the relatively low number, especially visible number of female candidates and women and younger women as well on the political roster. It's a question we encounter not just in Nigeria, as you said, but in many other contexts. I think it doesn't help when politics becomes viewed as the theater of very securitized and aggressive political environments, an environment in which very often, when you look at the campaign budget and planning of candidates, it involves muscle men, security guards. It's a very rough house environment, and I speak, primarily, for example, even in places like Kenya, and so I think that becomes an off-putting element. I think women still remain a very important voter constituency, but there needs, I think, to be much more deliberate effort to make sure that politics is not really seen as the arena of rough house campaigning, of very aggressive security, insecure political environments which just create a very ugly dynamic. I think also one of the unspoken elements of Nigerian elections is the cost of running for office. And I think even the official fees, Nnamdi would know this, but I remember reading that it's there's at least many thousands of dollars even to register officially as a candidate for president. So I think those are elements that need to be discussed. I think it's a really vitally important issue because if you're talking about a democracy, you need to make representation meaningful, and you can't let half of the electorate not really see themselves represented in the candidates that they view. So certainly the heavily patronage politics, the fact money is so important, and I'm sure the security environment can't help. But just to say that We'll continue to cover these issues. I'm sure we'll be hosting Nnamdi on some of our future podcasts, and we can put those questions specifically to him. But it's a really important one. I can't really speak in detail about the Nigeria environment, but across the continent, it's a really pertinent issue.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. Let's see if we can, let me just check with our producers of this event to see if we have any chance of getting Nnamdi back anytime soon. Let's see, 1 second, please. I do. Okay, well, we'll wait for his return. A few more minutes. We're sure we can get him back on.
Yes, so there's a question, I think, about a potential Obi victory, Pauline. Yes. In the meantime, I'll also do what you were trying to do in terms of raising.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. If Peter Obi would still need to rely on funds from allies of Atiku, or Tinabu, I think Tinabu is not spelled right, but that doesn't matter, in order to achieve his goals. And so I think that's a very interesting question, given that we're talking about money. And as you just pointed out, Murithi, money is often key in elections. And I think money is especially key in Nigerian elections, where some of the candidates are apparently multi-millionaires. I see we have Nnamdi back. Nnamdi, can you hear us? Nnamdi, you may be on mute. Can you please check your microphone?
Pauline, perhaps I could just come in briefly, and I have to say that I don't really know the details, and I'm sure Nnamdi, if you can hear me, you'll chime in. And the question is about, as Pauline said, whether Peter Obi, the kind of deals he would need to make, given that despite being a former governor, is a relative outsider at the national stage. And I think the question is really pertinent, and I would guess that yes, there would need to be a degree of deal making. I think the Nigerian presidency is a really powerful patch, but it's also a negotiated patch in such a vast country, in a country which has such significant diversity, and it's one where, for example, this whole devolved system has helped to keep things together, which again is something that we can learn from outside the country. But I would imagine that a degree of deal making, will not be out of place, if Obi wins. But I don't know if we have Nnamdi, Pauline.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. I'm
sorry, the internet service has been very bad. I was struggling to get back in, and I'm glad I finally got in. I didn't quite get the question, but my sense is that whoever wins, will have a great challenge in rebuilding national cohesion and rallying the country to a common vision. It's been a very acrimonious campaign, which has polarized the identity groups along ethnic and religious lines and so on. So there's going to be, whoever wins, a major challenge of healing and trying to bring people together again. Tinubu is running, the APC candidate is running on a Muslim ticket that has alienated a large number of Christians who do not think that that respects the religious diversity, of the country. So if he gets into office, he will still have to do a lot, to bring them to his side, to woo them and reconcile them to his vision for the country. Atiku Abubakar is a northerner succeeding, trying to succeed another northerner, and with a lot of people in the south, that is unacceptable. It's a very untenable position for many of them. So again, there'll be lots of people in the south, if he wins, who will be alienated from his government, and he will have to work doubly hard to build bridges with them and bring them in. The same thing applies to Obi. I mean, he has to build trust, especially in the north and among the Muslim population. There are people who, for all his pronouncements about, running, blind to religion and ethnicity, there are people in the north, especially, who still view him, very dimly and are very wary of, his Christian background. So again, if he gets into office, he would have to do a lot to convince people that he means well for the entire country, and it's not the president of Southerners or Christians only. So, I mean, whoever wins will have to do a lot to rebuild trust and to heal after this very acrimonious campaign.
So if we go back, Nnamdi, to the question that Richard Gosni asked, if Obi would win, would he still have to rely on money from outsiders or financiers to actually govern? Would that be an issue?
Sorry, I didn't quite get the question.
The question is, if Peter Obi would win, would he still need to rely on funds from outside financiers?
Well, I think whoever wins, Obi or Atiku or Tinubu or anyone else, will have a serious, funding challenge. We are in a situation where the government is running very lean on funds, and then also has a lot of loans, that it has to repay. So whoever comes in will have to, first of all, phase out the fuel subsidy, which is consuming a huge amount of money. That will be one source of, building government revenues. And then, of course, there's a real need to intensify internal revenue generation, and then stop leakages, for instance, in the oil sector, where huge amounts of oil are stolen, on a regular basis. So whoever comes in will have to address that challenge in order to create jobs and move the country forward. I think there's also the need for whoever comes in to rebuild a great deal of investor confidence, because the country needs a whole lot of investment, not only in the oil sector, in agriculture, in industry, in startups, and so on and so forth. So whoever comes in will have to do a lot to rebuild investor confidence and then bring in capital from outside the country.
And Nnamdi, while you were trying to reconnect, we had one question about women participation in these elections. Why there's so few, if any, female candidates. We have another question about that. So why are women not big candidates in Nigerian elections, and what can be done to encourage more women to come on the political scene?
Well, the first reason is resources. I mean, Nigerian elections are very, very capital intensive, if you like. And men who have been more prominently in politics and in business and so on are better able to provide the funds to run their campaigns than women. But the other issue is also about the very muscular nature of the politics in the country, which is can be very scary for a lot of women. They don't want to get into that, rough and tumble in the ring, and they would rather just stay away. So we're having a situation in which women remain a very small percentage of people running for offices, and it's a shame sometimes when you think of it, that they constitute more than half of the population, but then, in terms of electoral presence and governance, they are still in a very minority position.
So if we just shift the conversation a little bit, foreign policy hasn't been, while a lot of African countries are watching these elections, foreign policy apparently hasn't really been a major issue in these campaigns that you're seeing now. Are there any indications of what the world might expect from these three frontline presidential candidates when they get into office?
Yes, you're very correct. I mean, we've hardly heard any of them saying anything significant about foreign policy. For the first reason is that I think the country's internal challenges are becoming just so overwhelming that people don't even want to discuss anything about the rest of the world. They'll just rather concentrate on Nigeria. But I think all three candidates have had tremendous, considerable foreign exposure, especially also with the United States of America. Tinubu, the candidate of the APC, studied in the US, worked in the US. Atiku Abubakar actually has the American University in Nigeria. He brought it here, and it's in his town, in his state. And so that he has very good links, strong links with people in the US. Obi, similarly has a very Western-looking disposition, and would be very much interested in trade and technology and technical cooperation and so on with the West. So I think to that extent, they would be more Western-looking than Russia or China or anywhere else in the East. I think the second point also is that they would try to build good relationship with Western partners and donors. As I said earlier on, there's a dire need for improving the foreign investment profile of the country, and they would, want to go very seriously at that. So we don't expect any dramatic changes in foreign policy. The government, whoever wins, will be very much Nigeria focused. They will, by obligation, by long-standing obligations, they would still be concerned. They will still be engaged with ECOWAS and the African Union and so on. But I don't see any revolutionary idea, coming to the table.
And so, Nnamdi, if we look back a little bit at the legacy that outgoing President Buhari will leave, how would you sum that up? Has he been a disappointment?
I think it's been a disappointment, largely. He ran his campaign in 2015 on the promise that he was going to improve security in the country. He and his supporters and advisors and spokesmen point to the northwest, the northeast, that they pushed back Boko Haram. The security situation in the northeast had improved. Yes, there's no doubt about the legitimate claim. But generally, Nigerians feel less secure now than they felt 8 years ago. The kidnapping is more ubiquitous than it was before. Relationship between groups are more strained, and there's a lot more tension than before. So people don't really think that he is leaving the country any better than he found it in terms of security. The same applies to economy. The economy is in a more difficult position now than in the past. Again, he can point to some infrastructure that has been built with airports and seaports, the new seaport in Lagos and the Niger Bridge across the River Niger connecting the east and west of the country. These are significant, of course. But then he's also leaving the country with a lot more unemployment, a greater degree of poverty, about 63% of the population living in what the United Nations called multidimensional poverty. And so people think that as an economic manager, he has failed. But there's also the third aspect that people think he has mismanaged the country's diversity, that relations between identity groups are in a more difficult and strained form than they were, at the time he came. But then I think on the other side, we must give it to him that he has not tried to stay beyond. He has been very respectful of democracy and democratic institutions. He hasn't tried to tinker with the constitution. There's been no talk of a third term. And as I mentioned earlier, he has given the Independence Electoral Commission, the free hand to, carry out his job without any interference. He's generally been respectful of election results and so on, and all that is good for democracy. But at the moment, his legacy is not looking as glorious as he would have wanted it to be, and that's to put it mildly.
Has he said himself anything about these elections and the fact that he will leave power?
He has consistently said he would leave power, that his time is up, and he's very respectful of the term limits. And he said he wants to bequeath to the country a free and fair election as a key aspect of his legacy. So I think he's very concerned about this election being properly conducted. And then unfortunately, we're having the currency problem now that seems to be a real challenge to smooth conduct of the elections. but only by Saturday, and then in 2 weeks' time, we'll be able to see how well or how badly the elections went.
Right, because if you can remind us when will the results be in, and you also mentioned that there might be a runoff, which would be unprecedented for Nigeria. Is the INEC ready to organize that if they have to do a runoff for the first time in Nigerian history?
Well, usually with past elections, the results would come out maybe 2 days after, because they had to, carry the results from remote areas to urban centers, state capitals, and then start coming to Abuja. So that would take time. The collation process was a longer chain of activities. But with the new technologies that INEC has introduced, we've seen results being announced much faster than in the past. I mean, the last Osun state elections some months ago, the results were announced at the end of that day. And everybody already knew who the winner and who the losers were. So we expect that this time around, the results will be announced much faster than in the days when the Electoral Commission could not transmit results in real time to its portal at the headquarters. The runoff, we can rule that out, even though it might just end on the first ballot, but there's a little margin of we need to allow a little margin of the possibility that there will be a runoff. The Electoral Commission says it has already printed voting materials, in readiness for a runoff, because the electoral law allows only 21 days for the conduct of the runoff, and the time would be too short for it to engage with printers and get the materials and move them to states within 21 days. So I think it's already prepared for that eventuality, and it has assured the voters in the country that in the event of a runoff, it will be able to conduct, in the event of a tie, it will be able to conduct a runoff, within 21 days. But that would be up to the 18th of March.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Murithi, if you would have any closing comments?
No, just that, it's a really important election. Yes, a lot of negative elements, especially this currency crunch, as Nnamdi mentioned, but also some promise, especially the fact that it's reasonably unpredictable. And one just hopes that the various institutions will prepare for whatever outcome emerges, but especially that the candidates will stick by their commitments, to accept the results, to work with the winner. And so it's a really pivotal election, and a lot of people will be watching.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Well, thank you so much, Murithi, and thank you, Nnamdi. I'm very happy that you were able to join. I'm sorry about the electricity issues or the connection issues, but I'm glad that we got it sorted in time. Thank you for everybody who attended this event. We apologize for the connection issues, but we're all broadcasting from various African countries, so it's been a bit of an effort to pull this together. We're glad we managed in the end to get Nnamdi back, as I said before. The recording of this event will be available soon on our YouTube channel and also at Crisis Group websites, which you can find under event recordings. And with that, I would like to draw this to a close. Again, thank you for everybody, and we'll be looking forward to seeing how these elections will unfold this weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.